Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is the CSCCE Case Studies project. And so first of all, credit where it's due. This has been a collaborative project carried out by Simon Sadiq, who's our communications assistant, Katie Pratt, who you just heard from, our comms director, and myself. So Simon did a lot of the data gathering and the editing of the responses to the interview questions that we shared and the presentation of the case studies. Katie designed the case study template and was involved in the editing process, and the three of us have been doing the data analysis and the writing of the report and pulling out the challenges and the recommendations that we're going to get into today. And then, of course, thank you very much to the 25 members of our community of practice who willingly took part in these case studies and gave us some really fantastic data and insights into what these roles look like now across a spectrum of different contexts in the STEM ecosystem. And we're going to get into that a little bit today. So why did we decide to do this project, and why did we decide to do it now this year? So back in 2016, so before we even launched the first Community Engagement Fellows program, we did a small amount of research to really try and understand the current state of play, the current landscape for scientific community management. And so at that time, we had done a series of 10 interviews with community managers in a range of roles. And then we'd released a landscape survey where we got responses from more than 100 community professionals in STEM, where they told us a bit more about their backgrounds, how they'd come into their roles, the challenges and the emphasis that they were placing in their roles. And so what we'd found at that time was that scientific community managers are often self-taught. So although 2/3 of them held a STEM PhD, so highly skilled, highly trained in STEM, but then once they transition into these community management roles, they haven't had any training in that at all. So that was partly the justification for our fellows program, and then ultimately why CSCCE came about. And then when we heard about the challenges from these folks in the survey, prioritizing which tasks to focus on out of all the things that they have to do was a big challenge. And then relatedly to the issue of lack of training, they were keen to access professional development opportunities. So that was the state of play back in 2016. And we wanted to revisit these findings. We anecdotally have been seeing a lot more of these community management roles appearing in a range of what feel like new contexts, and we wanted to check whether this was indeed the case. We always want to highlight the vital contributions of community managers, and I think as we look across this emerging spectrum of roles now, we can see that community managers are involved in an increasing number of crucial STEM projects, right? So they're often involved in collaborative, culture change focused projects, whether that's around open science or whether that's around diversity, equity, inclusion, or whether that's around building more supportive research cultures at the local institutional level, that really, starting to be these critical pieces of human infrastructure. And so we really want to elevate that and make sure that that is visible. We hope then that we can use this to start conversations for aspiring community managers to see this as a viable career path, as something that might be right for them to do, and to help funders to really better understand these positions. What does a realistic job description look like for a community manager? How long do you need to fund a community manager for? Is it realistic to think a project's going to become self-sustaining after 2 or 3 years? What do community managers actually tell us about the reality on the ground? And then we also wanted to see whether there are any emerging trends. Can we look across this collection and see emerging patterns that perhaps weren't there in 2016 that might identify further places where CSCCE and others might want to provide support? And so I think it's also important to contextualize this, that this is one piece of research in a kind of broader portfolio of questions that we're asking, which is how do we describe the human infrastructure that powers collaboration in STEM? How do we map out the whole range of these community engagement roles in the various different contexts in which they arise? How do their job descriptions look the same or different? We have a working group working on that right now. Can we get to this shared language and shared mental models about how we envisage this exciting and emerging field that perhaps still doesn't have the attention and the recognition that it deserves. Okay, so how did we go about things? So we went back to those 2016 interviews and we revisited the questions that we'd used then and decided that with a few minor modifications, we were going to use them again in 2022. And we used that to create a survey instrument that CSCCE reached out and talked with our community of practice members about, to ask them to answer these 8 questions in prose form. So take the time, the space that they needed to really describe what it was that their roles looked like and how they came to them. At the same time, we wanted to do something that was perhaps a little bit more quantitative. So we also sent out our skills wheel worksheet. So many of you hopefully are familiar with the CSCCE skills wheel that has these 5 core competencies that community managers use. And to be clear, not every community manager uses all 45 of these skills within the competencies at once. There are different signatures at different stages in your role, different times of year, different stages in your career. We wanted to get some snapshots of what these skills wheel signatures look like for each case study participant over the last 12 months. And so in terms of recruiting participants for these case studies, we did this in 2 ways. So we were really interested in this idea of getting a snapshot of roles across this emerging spectrum. And so not only did we put out an open call, so anybody who was interested could get in touch and volunteer to take part, but we also did targeted outreach to make sure that we were getting representation across these roles. And so you can see from the logos, hopefully some of these are familiar, that we've got everything from activities that are being led by professional associations, so things like AGU. We've now got funders who are involved in community management of grantees. We've got activities that are part of infrastructure organizations, things like Crossref, and then we've got academic research collaborations where bringing folks together in working groups or connecting folks around the research is the role of the community manager. So lots of variation there in the context in which these roles are found. And so the 25 participants filled in their responses and sent them back to CSCCE. We had a short editing process, and then once a week, sometimes twice a week, we were releasing these over the summer. So you can, if you haven't seen them, you can go and download all 25 of those. They're beautifully curated on the website. Thank you, Katie. And you can browse through the collection. So that's how we did it. What did we find? So I'm going to go through this in a couple of thematic areas. So I'm going to start with the backgrounds and the focus areas of community managers. So what previous training do they have? Where do they come from? And then what kinds of contexts are they found in, and what kinds of projects are they working on? So first of all, most of the featured community managers in our first data set, we might make some more, are based at US institutions. There is a small amount of international representation. We did speak to folks in the UK, Europe, Australia, Japan, but just to note, partly by dint of the sheer size of the US, there's a lot going on that is US based. If you look at the kinds of disciplines that folks are focused on, and these are the little tags that you see in the top right of the case studies, there's this strong focus on software and code. This is definitely one area where folks have realized that that human infrastructure element is really important for software sustainability and for training in those essential kind of software skills that researchers are increasingly using. We also see that there's an emphasis on scholarly communication. So there's a lot of thinking both about the technical infrastructure that powers scholarly communication, how we share various research outputs, but also the culture of scholarly communication. So publishers such as eLife now thinking about things like their ambassador program and how to help propagate healthy research culture in the research ecosystem. And then there's also an emphasis on interdisciplinary collaboration, surprise, surprise, when we're bridging across disciplines and we're kind of brokering that shared knowledge and trying to move a project forward, that requires a coordinating person, a community manager. And then interestingly also, we have representation in the geosciences as well. So those are the disciplines that kind of jumped out from this initial data set. And then you'll see in terms of the organization type, this feels a lot broader to us than what we were observing in 2016, right? We're seeing funders now thinking about their role as conveners and how they might perhaps bring grantees together and have the grantees learn together from one another in cohorts and have the funder more actively engaged in that conversation. We know that infrastructure organizations are often funded in a community-oriented way. And so they increasingly are referring to their activities as community engagement and have staff with community in the job title. And then we've got various nonprofits, publishers, scientific societies and university-based research as well. Okay, so how did community managers come to their roles? So you'll remember on the first slide that I showed, we'd noted back in 2016 that 2/3 of community managers hold a STEM PhD, and interestingly that's almost exactly what we see again now. It does seem to be the most common career path into these roles. But some folks go up to master's level. We had 5 folks with a master's degree, 3 of which were STEM masters, and 5 had stopped at bachelor's level, 2 of which were in STEM. So it's not impossible to do these roles without STEM training. We've heard from folks who managed to do so quite successfully, but going all the way up to a PhD does seem to be the common route. And then just something to note about, there's still a fairly wide variety of job descriptions for these roles. But we only had 4 participants who were at that senior director level position. And partly that is also that we proactively reached out to get some director level folks. So they may even be overrepresented in this sample. So I think there's something to note here that this may be due both to the emergent nature of these roles. And, if an organization is going to experiment with their first community professional position, that may be a more junior position. They're not ready or perhaps able to fund at the director level. And that kind of ties in with the fact that most folks are going straight out of a PhD into these roles. Okay, so what do we see as some emerging trends from some of this data about the background and the focus areas of community managers? Well, first of all, community management is a highly gendered field, right? Most folks carrying out these roles identify as women. We see that in our classrooms, we see that in the CEFP fellowship program, we even see that today on today's call. And I think there's a very important consideration there that we talk about in our community engagement fundamentals course, and that others across the ecosystem are talking about too, that community management is fundamentally concerned with care, right? It's a role about, it's a human infrastructure role. It's about building relationships. It's about doing the often less visible work behind the scenes that sometimes we call glue, that helps things to run smoothly. And that's often less visible and less valued, and often labor that is associated with women. And so one of the things that I hope we get to talk about today in the discussion is the importance of really elevating and naming that less visible labor, and just how vital it is for kind of greasing the wheels of the way that we do all of these STEM projects. The second thing that has kind of emerged here is really the lack of training that is available to STEM community managers. So, if folks are going straight into their first community management role right out of a PhD, they're often expected to produce results quickly, and they're often placed in somewhat political contexts, right? They're working with multiple stakeholders, multiple participants of a project, both internally within their organization, maybe external folks who are interested in the project too. They're needing to get up to speed very quickly with the various different community members that they're meant to be figuring out how to engage. This is highly technical and somewhat political work. And, without any such training other than having gotten all the way through a PhD, it's perhaps not realistic to expect them to be able to to deliver the promises of the grants or the strategic plan that has been promised within their organizations. And, one of our big concerns from this report was that we're setting folks up to burn out, right? We're setting organizations up to be disappointed that their community work doesn't perhaps yield immediate results as quickly as they like, and that without organizations being able to provide training and support, because nobody else in the organization is doing community management in many cases, those community managers are not getting the professional development they need to be super successful in their roles. So that's something else that we'd really love to talk about at the end. And then finally, and I think this is exciting, and I think it's important to name, community managers are really essential for many culture change projects in STEM. We often refer to community managers as change agents. You can't do it all on your own, but you're the catalyst. You're really trying to help build communities, help listen and take in perspectives and model new ways of doing things. And that could be around metadata standards, that could be around shaping research culture, that could be around having organizational conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. You're really trying to make STEM better. But this work takes time again, right? And we often see that community managers are written into grants for perhaps a couple of years, and then there's a sort of expectation maybe they won't be needed anymore. And some of the concerns that I think emerge around this work are giving them the appropriate internal political support to succeed, making sure they're connected in with sponsors and mentors within their organization who are genuinely going to help move forward their work. And that there's also the financial backing to make sure that these feel like viable long-term roles that folks want to stay in and can be successful in. Okay, so that's the sort of background and focus areas. The second theme that I want to highlight now is the skills that STEM community managers use. So I already showed you the CSCCE skills wheel, these 5 core competencies and the 9 skill sets within each competency. So we'd asked every case study participant to fill this wheel in based on the frequency with which they used these skills. So 0 is not at all, and 3 is almost daily or daily. And so that gave us a distinct signature for every community manager that you can see on their case study. But Simon's also been having a lot of fun crunching that data behind the scenes and pulling out various trends. And this is but a tiny snapshot of all the various heat maps and things that Simon's been wowing us with. So there's definitely more to come on this particular topic. But for today, just to say that the 2 sort of high level things that jump out is, one of our hypotheses is that if we look at this interpersonal competency here, so all these skills around engagement, coaching and mentoring, cultural competence, emotional integration, things that often get rolled up into excellent written and verbal communication skills on a job description and not really unpacked. We think those are crucial. They're the kind of non-negotiables about being a good community manager. And indeed, if we look at the most used skills across the 25 case studies, what we see is that 4 out of 5 of those most used skills are in that interpersonal core competency. So collaboration, networking, consultation, engagement. So that kind of backs up this idea that the interpersonal competency is really the non-negotiable in these roles. But if we then look at the least used skills, what we see here is that 2 out of 5 of them are in the program development core competency. And we have this suspicion that things that fall into that competency, so if I go back here, things that fall into that competency are things that are often part of more senior roles, right? The things like advancement, thinking about the long-term organizational strategy for community, proposal development, being the lead PI on a proposal and getting the funding in to make sure that the project continues. And I think that reflects perhaps the fact that many of these are first role post PhD in nature, and so just the sheer youthfulness of this as a profession is showing that not everybody is getting into those program development skills just yet. It'll be interesting to watch how that changes over time, and also how that maps to different organizational contexts. You know, if you're the person, the only community manager, and you're doing everything, maybe you get into needing to do some of these things more quickly. Okay, so the next theme is job joys. So we explicitly ask, you know, what's so great about these roles? What do STEM community managers love doing? Why are they enthusiastic about their work? And so you can kind of see from this word cloud that three big things really jumped out to us. You know, the first thing, and we heard this phrased in multiple ways across the case studies, was that you really enjoy variety. You know, many community managers enjoy these highly dynamic roles where no 2 days look the same. And, you know, that can be exciting. That can keep things interesting. It can mean that you're, you know, always engaging with something new. And I think one of the things that follows perhaps from that is that community managers also really enjoy being creative. You know, they enjoy connecting with folks who have an idea and identifying somebody else that person can connect with, so that then they can find the solution to the idea, to the problem that they're trying to solve. And you get that sort of magical spark of something being created. And we heard that again reflected throughout the case studies. And of course, closely tied in with this is this importance of relationships, right? That you all enjoy on some level these human interactions, you know, identifying who to connect, being there to listen for ideas and what the community might want to do next, helping even to kind of resolve issues or help co-create this shared vision of where to go on a project, or how to resolve disagreements. And so I think it's actually interesting that these three themes really do feel like they weave together and help create a very compelling case for why these roles can be so appealing. But not all smooth sailing, right? So there were also 5 themes that emerged through these case studies of challenges that STEM community managers are facing. And so you can see on this really cool plot over on the right that these are not mutually exclusive, right? So you can pick one of these difficulties, and you can see the number of folks who expressed it as a difficulty, and then the folks who were also expressing it in relation to another one of the difficulties. And I think this is important, right? Because where you see the overlap is where I think you start getting concerned. You start worrying about burnout, or you start worrying about lack of empowerment in these roles, and what impact that has on the individual community manager, and possibly also the community success as well. So these 5 categories of difficulties start out with a general sense of underappreciation, right? That the precise role of community managers, exactly what it is that you do, is perhaps generally misunderstood at some level. And not everybody emphasized the same level. Some folks feel very well supported by their organization, but it reflects that maybe the role is less well understood in general across the broader scientific community, so the wider ecosystem in STEM. Others felt that, you know, their role was even not that visible in terms of the value that they were adding through all the consultations that they were doing directly with community members. So there's still this sort of slippery, not quite easy to describe way of why community managers are as vital as they are. The second thing that emerged was that community managers are really busy. You know, one of the downsides of this constant variety and creativity, perhaps, is that there's always something else to do, right? And there can be a sense of overwhelm, or just simply a difficulty of working out what ought to make its way to the top of your to-do list today. Another thing that emerged was the challenge of keeping community members engaged. And this is something else that I'd like to talk about in terms of our recommendations, that while we're seeing this proliferation of community manager roles, we're also seeing a proliferation of scientific communities, right? And that means that the individuals and often the volunteers that are being asked to engage in these communities are actually being pulled into multiple different projects. And I think one potential downside of that is that we're burning out all the volunteers, and that's resulting in lower engagement across projects as a whole. And it's been very interesting anecdotally to observe how more and more organizations and projects are now collaborating together on particular things so that they can pool resources and pool members who are interested in a common topic rather than kind of tugging them in multiple directions at once. So the fourth challenge that we touched on already earlier was just a general inexperience, right? A lack of formal training. And importantly, because these roles are new within their organizations, it's not like you can start a job and follow a mentor within your organization about how to do this. You know, typically there isn't somebody else in your organization who's doing community work that you can learn from. So, you know, that training needs to be provided externally. And obviously that's one of the reasons why we exist as an organization. And then finally, and this may have become more and more apparent because of the pandemic and the rapid shift to working online, there's an increasingly global emphasis on the work that community managers are doing. And so something else we observed across the case studies was, you know, the challenges that community managers are now having with juggling work across time zones so that members in different countries are able to make the calls and the activities that they're hosting. Really starting to think about translation and what it means to create multilingual content that's appropriately contextualized and useful for folks in different countries, different places around the world, and managing those cultural differences, you know, acknowledging that there are different ways to engage and different ways to communicate about the work that we're doing and how to really be culturally responsive and appropriately contextualize what we're doing. Okay, so that is just a taster of what is to come. So we're a good way through writing this all up into the final report that we're going to publish in September. So here's the sneak preview of the beautiful front cover that Katie's put together. If you want to hear about that, I think most of you are already on our monthly newsletter, but we'll be sure to let folks know through via that newsletter. A reminder that you can explore all of the case studies through the curated page on the website. So folks are arranged alphabetically, and we've got these little call out cards so you can see who's who. And if you want to follow up afterwards with any questions or even request to make a case study about yourself, we may yet do future iterations of this. So if that is something of interest, let us know and we can consider whether that's something that we've got capacity to do. So thank you again to all 25 participants of the case studies. It was wonderful to be able to learn from everybody. Thank you for sharing so candidly your experiences. And yeah, we're really looking forward to your comments, questions, where we should take this next.